Welcome, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you this evening at this event that is co-sponsored by the Center for the Study of American Democracy and Kenyan Women Giving Back. I'm Joe Klesner. I am a professor of political science at Kenyon College and the director of the Center for the Study of American Democracy. We want to thank Sarah Longwell for taking some time out of her very busy schedule to be with all of us Kenyanites this evening. We're at a major turning point in American political history with Donald Trump's second inauguration to take place on Monday. The past year has been like none other in recent American history in terms of the level of conflict and disagreement in our society. Meanwhile, we've witnessed two major wars taking place around the world in which we have been more than peripherally involved. Conflict, polarization, anxiety, these words seem to characterize our times. Sarah, you've been uniquely placed to observe our current circumstances. In your work with the Bulwark and the focus group podcast, you've been learning directly from voters about how they view current events and political players. As a former head of the Log Cabin Republicans, then working with Never Trump organizations, you've come to know the main players from the Republican Party who have worked to limit Mr. Trump's impact on the party and the polity. You've grown the Bulwark into a major voice in the center right of the political spectrum today. And you've been a stalwart supporter of Kenyon College and of the Center for the Study of American Democracy, and we thank you for that. So let's jump into it. Sarah, you spend a lot of time talking to voters in focus groups, including, I understand, several that have gathered in the last few days. Can you briefly tell us how you do that, how you recruit participants, how the conversations go for those of us who haven't watched them? And share with us what you've learned about why the presidential election tipped the way it did.
Yeah, well, first of all, hey, everyone. It's great to be here. I love Kenyon more than I love just about anything else. I've got 3 Kenyon grads who work for me. The Kenyon Political Science Department keeps sending them my way. And I love the Kenyon Political Science Department. I love the Kenyon softball and field hockey team, both of which I played on when I was there. So this is one of my favorite things to do, is talk to people from Kenyon. And I hear from people from Kenyon all the time who are Bulwark fans, and it's the most fun thing. So anytime people come to shows and stuff, and they say, like, my kid goes to Kenyon, or they wear their Kenyon gear, and it is my favorite. So on the focus groups, look, the reason I started doing the focus groups is because, back in 2016, I was like, what just happened? Why did this happen? And especially for Republican voters, I had sort of come up in a conservative movement that, to be fair, I realized later just how disconnected it was from sort of actual voters. But I sort of came up through like think tanks and had come out of the Kenyon Political Science Department, sort of University of Chicago, and so I was like, well, wait a minute. How can the Republican Party that I think of elect a guy like Donald Trump? This guy has terrible character. I was raised on the idea that character mattered. His values. He was a limousine liberal for a million years. Clearly not. So I just didn't understand. And that's when I started to do my first sort of focus groups to figure out, can we primary this guy? How are we going to get rid of Donald Trump? And back then, you'd go to a facility. I would drive to York, Pennsylvania, or I'd fly to Arizona, and you'd gather a group, and they have focus group facilities. Now, normally, the way that people do focus groups is, the reason people do them is not always because of politics. In fact, most of the time, it's like they're trying to sell a new brand of dog food or something, and they're holding up packages like, do you like the blue one or do you like the red one? And they're like marketing things. But I learned so much traveling around listening to Republicans explain why they had voted for Donald Trump. And I got sort of addicted to it, especially as the time got more and more complicated. I found listening to voters could be very grounding, because voters are just cheat code for politics, right? Like, we live in a democracy. The people are the ones who are going to vote. Understanding why they make the decisions they do, what information they're getting, is like how you understand what's happening in politics. I will say COVID kind of changed the game for us, because once we were in lockdown, I was like, hey, can I do these by Zoom? And they were like, well, we can figure that out. And once we could do them by Zoom, I could do them at scale, which meant like I could do a group a week. We could get like women who voted for Trump but thought he was doing a very bad job from all the different swing states together in one group. And once I could kind of mess with it that way and not have to fly, I just started to do it constantly. And it's been I did it because I was building campaigns. Like I was running a campaign called Republican Voters Against Trump. I was trying to figure out how we were going to beat Trump. And I needed to figure out who the persuadable voters were and what was going to persuade them as a Republican not to vote for Donald Trump. And in doing that work, I started to share out loud what I was hearing in the focus groups. And more, one of the things I realized is that if people could hear what I was hearing, they would understand more like what we were up against, in large part because they would understand that it's a lot of times when people have an opinion, they're like, well, they make an argument and they make an argument with information that they have. They don't realize they assume this other person also has that information. And the number one things that I learned in the focus groups is people do not have that information. Like I was just doing one the other day and we were asking about Pete Hegseth because Pete Hegseth just went through his confirmation hearing. He is one of the most unqualified picks by Donald Trump for Department of Defense. And I asked a group of Republican voters, Trump voters, what did they think of Pete Hegseth? And they all said, who's Pete Hegseth? And that's like, that is an eye-opening kind of thing to realize just how little information people are operating from. And anyway, to go to the bigger point, which is, why did Donald Trump win and Joe Biden lose? I tape a podcast that I do called The Focus Group, where we listen to the sound and I sort of play it for people so that they can hear for themselves what voters are saying. And I taped it with Evan Osnos, who is Biden's biographer. He's wrote the book on Biden. He sits down with Biden a lot. And we were talking about Biden's legacy because he's giving his farewell speech here in a few minutes. And I was playing for him sound from voters going into 2020, people that we had identified as persuadable voters who had voted for Trump in 2016 but thought he was doing a terrible job. And even then, those voters were like, yeah, maybe I'll vote for Joe Biden, but he's so old. He's and they were like, or I'll vote for him just because of how much I hate Donald Trump, or just because I want a steady hand on COVID. And Evan and I were talking about just how shallow much of the Biden support was, even from the jump, from sort of the narrow group of people that put him over the edge in a bunch of the swing states. And you add on top of that narrow willingness to vote for him against Trump. And you add on to that, basically, now he's 4 years older. He's also not campaigning during COVID, which means people see a lot more of him. Plus, he's got a record to run on, one that many people were frustrated about the economy, very frustrated about immigration. And then you layer on top of that the Trump amnesia of 4 years having gone by where people just had forgotten why they hated him so much. And I think that, obviously there's a lot of reasons why this happened, but that's a big part of it, is kind of those things added together.
So what do you think Democrats are failing to recognize about voters' concerns? They seem to be flailing about these days.
Well, look, I think I gave this TED talk like a year or so ago, and it was kind of about it was about democracy. It was for TED Democracy, and I argued in it this very unpleasant reality, which is that voters don't care about democracy. And I think that Democrats and Biden really thought, man, if we just tell people what a threat Donald Trump is to democracy, and I, of course, think this. I hosted an event between Liz Cheney and Kamala Harris, and they really were beating this. But the whole time I was just sort of like, these are not the bread and butter issues that voters really vote on. And, one of the things I did a lot of on the podcast was like playing for people the sound of, let's say, a 26-year-old talking about how expensive they think their groceries are, how much they can't afford to find housing. Housing, especially for young people who aren't in the market, you just hear it come up over and over and over again. And also, so like people were frustrated with Biden about the economy. And then like when you say like, what do Democrats need to learn? Man, so much. But one of them is Joe Biden operated as if we lived in like an old media environment. And like, if you just do some good things, voters will know about it and they will reward you for that. And that is not the world that we live in anymore. And I have people around me sometimes who are arguing things like, you gotta find your own demagogue. And I reject that. I reject that. I don't think Democrats need to find their own demagogue. I do need to think they need to find somebody who knows how to communicate authentically with for voters. Voters want to see that you have a fire in your belly for solving problems and can talk to them about the things that they're feeling and are going to do something about it. Now, so much of what Trump does is pernicious in the sense that he bases a lot of that authenticity and that connection with voters on, I hate the same people you hate. And so you don't need to emulate that as a Democrat, but you do need to find effective communicators who can articulate. Yeah, I think like that was the thing about Kamala Harris. You know, things got so much better when it was her, but people were still like, "What's an opportunity economy? Like, what are you talking about?" You know, like, and Democrats. Oh, this is just like I said. This could be a long list. Talking to people like normal, like I'm just begging Democrats. My buddy Ben Wickler is running for the head of the DNC right now. Well, I like him. He's really a great guy, and he's smart. But he put out this tweet the other day, which I gave him some grief about. It was like, I talked to the AAPI and the LGBTQ plus and it was just group after group after group about representation. And Americans, especially younger ones, they are not interested in being put in some categorical box. They want to be Americans. They want you to talk to them like they're normal. They don't want all the like, I mean, the woke stuff is sort of too much. Like to just be like everything, I dismiss everything as woke is sort of equally stupid, but you do have to communicate to people clearly and on grounds where they feel like you're talking to them like a human. And then the last thing I'll say is Democrats need to say something about immigration. They need to have a way that they talk about immigration that is, you know, anything that resembles a policy. Like they just not saying anything about it has become a real liability for them. And when I talk to Democratic groups and they ask me like, well, what's the one thing we could really do differently? I'm like, you got to figure out how to talk about immigration because Republicans are killing you on it. And that was a big part of what happened when Joe Biden was able to. They thought they could win people by saying, well, we put up a bill and Republicans wouldn't take it. You can't communicate with regular Americans like that about a bill that then the Republicans didn't, they didn't sign on
Mhm.
to. That's not the world we live in. All Americans saw was that the border was open and then Joe Biden, right before the election, was able to close it. And they took that to mean, oh, this was something that could be done and you just didn't do it. And it's a real liability for them, especially in those swing states like Pennsylvania. That's the reason you see people like John Fetterman getting on board with like the Lake and Riley Act, because he knows how vulnerable Democrats are on that issue. Long answer, sorry.
So, oh, wait, we could have you here and you could give us a long seminar on it. It would be a terrific thing for our students, maybe later for that one. Well, listen, Donald Trump is not going to govern alone, even though sometimes he might imply he can. And the Senate has been holding confirmation hearings for his nominees to the cabinet and other high-level offices over the past couple of days, and this will go on for a while. What do those nominations suggest to you about the policies the new Trump administration will pursue, and also about how this new government will govern?
Well, this is not going to come as a surprise to anybody that, the second term of Donald Trump is going to be a lot different from the first. And the reason is that the first one was staffed by people like Jim Mattis and a lot of people like Trump didn't expect to win and didn't know what to do. So he basically said, okay, establishment, Washington Republicans, like staff me up. And they did with a bunch of people who, if you've read the books about the first Trump term or a lot of the reporting that's been done, I mean, it was literally Trump trying to order things and Mattis and other ones pulling them off his desks and like throwing them out. Constantly looking for ways to sort of put guardrails against his worst impulses. And they all sort of figured out, how do you sort of manipulate him out of doing the worst things he wants to do? Like, hey, I want to shoot protesters in the leg. Esper was just on 60 Minutes talking about how Trump was like, well, go shoot the protesters. And he said, no, you can't do that. He is not going to have any of those people this time. And if you're watching these hearings, so I've unfortunately, like, it's a professional hazard where like I sit and I watch all of these hearings, and I sat through Pam Bondi today, sat through Pete Hegseth earlier this week or yesterday. I can't
Yesterday.
remember, but his time's a flat circle. But it is like, and Pete Hegseth. So Pam Bondi was interesting in the sense that she's at least professionally qualified for the role. She is AG in Florida. She's done real legal work. But the problem is that Pam Bondi also, in her sort of activist capacity, tried to help Trump overturn the 2020 election. And if you watched her hearing today, what she did was everything sounded more or less normal, except for the parts where people were asking her about the 2020 election, where she would elide, like she would say, like, well, Joe Biden is the president. She wouldn't say Donald Trump won. I'm sorry, she wouldn't say Joe Biden won. She would just say he is the president. She also claimed there was a peaceful transfer of power. Like, this is the thing about that. Sometimes people are like, you were never Trump and now you're never Republican. And I say, the problem is, guys, is that Trump has so thoroughly corrupted everybody that now they've all done things that are disqualifying for them to hold public positions. Now, in the case, though, of Pete Hegseth is not remotely qualified for the job that he's being. Department of Defense is a 3 million person bureaucracy. He's never run anything larger than a couple of these nonprofit groups, which he also financially mismanaged those, not to mention the sexual assault allegations. And so that I got, Kash Patel, who was kind of the star of the Pam Bondi hearings today. So remember, Matt Gaetz was nominated originally for AG, who was run out of town for accusations and a congressional report about sexual trafficking of minors, paying women for sex, minors for sex. Like, that guy, Trump put him up to be the highest law official in this country. And so now everybody's looking at Pam Bondi being like, thank God, like, whew, really dodged a bullet with Matt Gaetz. But underneath her is going to be Kash Patel at the FBI. And so the senators kept bringing up Kash Patel because Kash Patel literally wrote a book. He's a big QAnon conspiracy theorist, tried to help overturn the election in 2020. He has an enemies list that he's published in his book of people he would go after and prosecute were he to become FBI director. And I was at a deal book thing for the New York Times with Kevin McCarthy and Kellyanne Conway and a bunch of, Jason Miller. And, they were asked, well, what about this enemies list? And they were like, well, maybe they've committed crimes, Like, so I think when you say, what can we expect? I do think Trump's promises of retribution are absolutely on the table. I also think that we're wheels off in terms of having people in major parts of the government who have no experience and are totally unqualified to be there. Today's hearing with Pam Bondi was interesting in that they were saying, well, what if the White House tries to put pressure on you to interfere in things? And she was like, well, why would that happen? And the Democrats were pointing out, because he did it to the last couple of AGs. He did it to Pete Sessions. He did it to Bill Barr. They have all written books and everything else talking about how the White House tried to interfere. And she was like, well, and so the extent to which they are all Trump loyalists now has just, I can't tell you how different it is from a policy perspective. I do think I'm super interested to see how Doge, which is the Elon Vivek, I would love to tackle the debt. I think reducing the debt is a national security issue. It's deeply important to me. It's one of the things that I rooted my conservatism in back in the day. But the idea that Elon and Vivek are going to be able to, he's already walked back his idea that he could cut $2 trillion out of the budget. And part of that is because the discretionary part of the budget is actually already only 1.7 million. But he's walked that back to about 1 million. If Trump is going to cut taxes, which he's absolutely going to do, and they're going to spend more on the military to do this lethal fighting force, and they're going to cut $1 trillion from the federal budget, I am very interested in how those things line up. And so, I do think that they will do the immigration. There's a big debate in Washington about whether they do deportations for show and get enough photo ops. Like, the business community in this country very much hopes that Donald Trump is going to do a couple of things for photo ops and then not do mass deportations, not do roundups at businesses. They are sure that he doesn't mean it, which, by the way, is one of Donald Trump's superpowers. People, if they whatever he's saying they like, they say, oh, he means that. But if they don't like it, they say, well, he doesn't really mean that. He's not really going to do it. And so seeing how they handle immigration, especially the promise of mass deportation, that's also going to be very expensive. And people are probably not going to like it when the American military shows up and raids businesses. So, there's a lot of, I think, look, he's going to get sworn in on Monday, and he's got hundreds of executive orders ready to go. And so we don't know what all of those are, but what I think you can anticipate is it's going to be a fast jump, because they didn't know what they were doing last time. There's that part in Jurassic Park where the velociraptors figure out how to turn the doorknobs. And that's what this second Trump administration is going to be like. Like, they will have figured out how to work the doorknobs.
Can they do all the things that they say they're going to do all at once? Is there a bandwidth issue?
Well, I mean, it sort of depends on which things they do. I do think there's obviously, like I said, Doge and Trump's agenda, like, those are inherently in conflict. So is implementing a lot of the things they say they're going to implement, while also significantly cutting the federal workforce. Like, who is going to execute all of this stuff if you're implementing Schedule F and you're sort of gutting the civil service divisions here? So can they do it all? Boy, one of the things about Trump that I always, there's a lot of talk right now with the Jack Smith report coming out. Finally, we got to see sort of the draft, and it's just a report. Nothing will ever be done with it. But, there's a lot of frustration with somebody like Merrick Garland, right? Let Merrick Garland, where was I going with this? Say again, what did you just say? I'm like going to lose my
I was asking whether they had the bandwidth to do all the things that they, say they're going to do all at once.
Sure. But, like, here's the thing. Merrick Garland ran that thing for 4 years and still, like, they couldn't finish it. And I don't know. I don't think that's exactly where I was going. I do this sometimes. I have, like, too much to say and I get off the rails. But anyway, the point is that there's going to be inherent contradictions all over the place between, we're getting rid of the government, we're cutting all these things down, we're getting rid of the workforce, and then also we're going to do all these things. Now, but one of the things they can do, and the reason I bring up the executive orders, is that Trump is going to try to go around Congress more than you've ever seen. It's funny, we were all watching Pam Bondi, but the OMB hearing was also going on with Russ Vought. And he's a big Project 2025 guy. And they were asking him what he was going to do about just a specific, it's not obscure, but it's not worth going into what the actual policy is. They were like, well, what are you going to do about this? And he's like, well, the president's policy is X, and I'm going to try to implement that. And they're like, but the Supreme Court has already ruled on this. Like, there's a law of the land. And he was kind of like, yeah, well, I mean, like, the amount of, and this was also my point about Merrick Garland, like, what are you going to do? So the DOJ is not going to be there to restrain him, but the courts, that's why I was talking about Merrick Garland. Institutions and their stewards, like Merrick Garland, like, it's a tough position for him to be in, because nobody stresses these institutions like Donald Trump has. What Merrick Garland was in the position of saying, guy definitely broke the law. He inspired all these other people to break the law, but he's also a former president, and we don't do that here. And that's why he didn't appoint a special counsel and really move on it until it became clear Donald Trump was going to run again, and going to be actually run for president, because he didn't want to go after a former president. So the way that Donald Trump in particular strains these institutions, and that's what we're up against. Like, when you say, like, well, what can they do it? I don't know, because the institutions have never been pressure tested against what Donald Trump is about to bring. And the executive orders, like, immediately half of them are going to be, they're going to all end up in court. We're going to be litigating forever.
Yeah. Yeah. But despite the litigation, will policies be implemented anyway?
I mean, some, look, they're gonna do They're going to do deportations. Like they're going to, and especially people who are already convicted of crimes, like that'll happen first.
Sure.
They will certainly maintain where the border is right now because once Biden closed it, it did stop the flow of illegal immigration.
Mhm.
They will probably put more immigration judges. Like there are some things, and there are some things in there that are good. We need more immigration judges at the border so that people aren't sitting there in detention facilities unable to go through their court cases. They are going to reallocate money to do something about the border. But they're also probably going to engage in things that are going to feel really gross to a lot of people on the immigration front. Um,
Mhm.
like I think they will. I think they're gonna. I think he's gonna lower taxes. I mean, I think that's one of
Yeah.
the big things that Donald Trump is committed to, that his buddies really want to see him do, and I think he'll do it.
So you've mentioned already some of the kinds of tensions among the folks who are going to work for him, and we've heard Steve Bannon say that he was going to have Elon Musk out of there by before the inauguration. That there's a definite conflict between Musk and the other so-called tech bros, and Bannon and those who are on the sort of more longstanding MAGA group that we're seeing playing out in pretty acute way right now. Where do you see that going? Do you and I guess more generally, what do you make of Musk's sudden entry into politics, even if he's not like in an elected or otherwise appointed position, whatever this Doge thing is?
Um, there's actually a lot in the whole Musk deal. So part of it is, I, and let's just put Musk aside and talk about Facebook or Meta and Zuckerberg first. So Zuckerberg in 2020, it was actually a big controversy. They called him Zuckbucks. He did all this stuff to help preserve the infrastructure for the election.
Mm.
Facebook was the first one to ban Trump. So why is Zuckerberg running to Trump now? There's sort of two things I think going on. One, I do think these guys are kind of red pilled. And this is where I know you referred to something earlier as center right. I think it was the Bulwark, which is fair. That is actually, we found it. We think of ourselves as center right, except that assumes there's like this linear, there's this line, right? And it's like
Yeah.
left and right and center, and there's center right here. Those things just don't exist anymore. Like those are not the ways we're going to think about politics. And red pilled is basically like, I got so mad at liberals yelling at me online that I've decided to align myself with Donald Trump because I can't satisfy the left. And Donald Trump is completely transactional. And if I give him $1 million, he'll stop saying he's going to put me in jail, which is what he said to Zuckerberg.
Yeah.
And he'll invite me to Mar-a-Lago and like all his people will suddenly be nice to me. And I can curry favor to like, if I'm, what's his face from the Washington Post, I get to colonize Mars. If
Mhm.
I'm Elon, maybe I get to buy TikTok. We deserve a better robber baron class in this country because they're all these like kind of broken boys. Elon has like a jillion children by a bunch of different women. One of them's trans and doesn't like him. And this broke him in such a way that, I mean, so much of this stuff I don't want, and I would like to not, as a person who cares about politics, spend my time examining the fragile egos of our billionaire class, but they have enormous influence over politics now. And because Donald Trump is completely transactional, and because they can now like, and Musk in particular, just to go back to him, Musk has his own power base. The number of people in the focus groups who are like, I didn't really vote for Trump. I voted for Musk or I voted for RFK. Like people saw, and like, Elon Musk, RFK, Tulsi Gabbard, Donald Trump. No offense to the Democrats in the room, but 10 years ago, they were all Democrats. Joe Rogan, like they're all Democrats. And this is why red pilled, right? They're not like conservative policy people. They just think they understand the way Trump works because he too is a broken child. And they all realize that they can work together to all make a ton of money and have the systems just sort of work in their favor. And Elon Musk is not elected, couldn't be. He's from South Africa. He came here illegally. And but nobody cares, right? He has his own platform, his own massive communication platform, and he's the richest guy in the world. So he and Donald Trump, normally what happens with Donald Trump is that he gets in a fight with somebody like this, doesn't like it when people say things like President Musk, and his ego's fragile too. So it all falls apart. Remember, he fired Bannon after like 5 seconds because Bannon was telling reporters, like, I'm the architect of this whole thing. But Musk is much more powerful than Steve Bannon. However, that's just one part of the question. The other part of the question is, how do you deal with the tech bro class versus the pure MAGA class? Because those are not the same thing, right? And that is like one of the reasons that Donald Trump was able to put together a new coalition is because the tech bros brought him new people, mainly young men who've been like marinating in the manosphere for a long time. But, you know, the Laura Loomer set, the true blue MAGA types, they don't like these guys. These guys are immigrants, like immigrants, especially smart ones, you know, ones that they hire to work in their companies on H-1B visas. And so you can already see the tensions brewing between pure MAGA and the tech MAGA. And the question is whether or not that, and this is where I think I'm going to derive my most joy over the next 4 years, is I do think over time they end up eating each other alive. How their relationship with Trump works, I'm not sure, but certainly they are going to come for each other because having Trump's ear and having influence over him and being on the winning end of those transactions is like the coin of the realm with all those guys. And so they will murder each other for it. And that'll be fun. That's nice to watch.
Well, one of your recent additions at the Bulwark that I've really enjoyed is your George Conway Explains It All to Sarah podcast. I was just listening to one last night when I was walking. We've just had the release of Jack Smith's report that you've mentioned already, at least the part that summarizes the work on their January 6th piece. Let me just ask the general question here. You've had several conversations with George. What's your takeaway regarding the state of our legal and judicial system today?
Well, first of all, you know, George and I started that podcast. George is like obviously somebody who got famous because he was married to Kellyanne Conway and now they're divorced. And he's like, he went from being a very serious, high profile DC lawyer to like a Twitter gadfly and somebody who just like tried to, you know, kind of twist the knife on Trump. But he is, you know, when we started the podcast, because I am very much not a lawyer. And back when Donald Trump, all the indictments were coming down, I needed somebody to help me understand all of just all the different court cases. And I think that, and George is actually, he's a brilliant legal scholar. He's argued in front of the Supreme Court. And so there's like his Twitter persona, and then there's his actual legal expertise, which is very, very good. And look, the state of the judicial system. So on one hand, it's tough, right? Donald Trump has now appointed the majority of the people sitting on the Supreme Court, or there is a majority Republican, and he has appointed many of them. He will likely get to appoint somebody else. My guess is Clarence Thomas or Alito step down now that it's Trump, and he gets another couple of picks who are much younger. And now I will say, like, the thing about the Supreme Court is the Supreme Court's not going to give Donald Trump everything he wants. Amy Coney Barrett has proved to be an independent jurist. I think that, you know, Roberts is always kind of looking for a middle ground. Kavanaugh, though, is a big supporter of the executive, like executive power. And so Trump is going to have, he's going to start with a big chunk of people who are willing to let him do the things they want to do. And also because he has presidential immunity now. I mean, one of the things about Jack Smith's, you know, attempt to seek an indictment on Trump is that a bunch of things went to the Supreme Court. And in that they found presidential immunity. He is now going to be immune this time, which is another big change from before. And yet, so it's both bleak on one hand, and yet it is the number one backstop because I think George's opinion, and he knows much more about this than I do, but I would say listening to him talk about this, I don't know that I'm sure his faith is misplaced, and I hope it's not, but he still has a lot of faith in the system broadly, and in like, he would view somebody like Judge Cannon, for example, who, by the way, I think probably, I don't know if you guys, if I'm speaking, Eileen Cannon, who is basically this Florida judge who has made sure that Donald Trump's Documents case never went to trial, which is one of the slam dunk cases. She blocked for him. She did all kinds of things that people, whether they're Trump appointed or not, are looking at being like, this is not how a judge is supposed to operate. He'll probably put her on the Supreme Court. But generally, she's an outlier. And so, just like in 2020, where the courts were the backstop against Trump's fraudulent claims that the election was stolen and his attempts to overturn it, I do think you're going to see a lot going to the courts. And like I said, he's going to pressure test all this stuff. He'll win some, he'll lose some. Obviously, my hope is that they're there to stop the very worst stuff.
So, what does the Trump resistance look like now? Some folks are asking, well, what can the average person do to effectively protest against what will be coming down?
Yeah, so look, another big difference from last time, and it's a tough difference, it's a tough one to swallow, is that last time, because Trump lost the popular vote, and it was very close in a handful of states, it was easy to sort of tell yourself, this was an accident, right? This was an accident. People didn't realize, they didn't think he was going to win. Hillary Clinton was a bad candidate, and he doesn't have a popular mandate. This time, if you're arguing, and I mean, you're seeing this in the hearings. Pete Hegseth in his opening statement was basically like, Trump wants me, and Trump has a mandate. Pam Bondi did the same thing. They are going to rely on the fact, and look, there's some truth to this, right? The not a majority of the American people, when all was said and done and counted, he was stayed under 50%, but he did win the popular vote, and so there's a difference now, right? Basically, what happened is the American people, now, like I said before, lots of things the American people didn't know. They could not keep those court cases. I mean, that court cases became total white noise to them. I mean, I am a close watcher of the news and I couldn't, keep all that stuff. But the fact is, and it is like, this is a really tough pill to swallow. People saw January 6th. They saw all the indictments. They saw COVID. They saw all of it. And they said, yeah, we'll do it again. Now, I can give you a million reasons why, and why a lot of the people who made those decisions aren't bad people and who just cared about the price of eggs, or, they had real things that they cared about, or real concerns about Joe Biden, and that basically, Kamala Harris didn't really solve when she came in. But it's true that he was elected knowing all those things. And so a lot of that stuff, you're just not going to hear about it as much anymore. Like, I think the hashtag resist is not the way it's going to go. I think people realize that this last, the last hope, the way that people thought, you could beat him last time, it wasn't enough. And I think that my personal advice is to start, one of the bright spots, I think, for Democrats in the Trump era was that they fielded a ton of new people that were awesome. Like, they've got this huge bench of pretty charismatic, like temperamentally moderate, not necessarily policy moderate, but Wes Moore, Abigail Spanberger, I think is going to be the next governor of Virginia. I don't know if you've been watching Alyssa Slotkin, in the hearings, but she's awesome. She's terrific. But they need this new generation of people, your Gretchen Whitmers and your Josh Shapiro's. Like, there's a robust bench. And my hope is that these people emerge as leaders. But I'll also say it's very possible that the next person to lead the Democratic Party is not a politician, right? It's a Mark Cuban type. And I think that the ground up resistance isn't going to work the way that people sort of felt it did before. I think a leader needs to emerge who is a good communicator and has a lot of charisma, not a demagogue, not somebody like Trump, but has a lot of charisma that people feel like they can follow, that they can build movements in the wake of. People talk a lot about Trump and they're like, well, he's got this media ecosystem. Here's the thing. What Trump has is an economic model, an incentive structure, where for MAGA influencers, the more good things you say about Trump, there's a whole audience there, desperate to follow your stuff and to give you money and to buy you your merch. And that's how Candace Owens and Benny Johnson, many of whom are funded by Russia, by the way, like literally actually in litigation right now because it came out that they were being funded by Russia because they have the things that they do are exactly what Russia would like to divide Americans. Like, that's the kind of propaganda they put out. But Democrats are going to have to realize the media environment that they live in, and they're going to have somebody who can make the case. I'll tell you, if you listen to my stuff, I was going nuts the whole time with Biden because Biden couldn't communicate with people, couldn't talk to people. He didn't have it. And then they hit him too. They hit him and they hit Kamala. Like Donald Trump and JD Vance were going on every stupid man podcast in the world. And it's not about whether or not she went on Joe Rogan. It's about how do you have the new Democratic strategy. I did not care for this movie, but it's a good communication strategy. It's got to be everything, everywhere, all at once, right? You have to be everywhere. You got to go on Fox News. You got to go into these uncomfortable places and you got to convince people because that's the new media environment that we're living in. And so I'm watching Democrats in these hearings and like they're pretty impotent. I mean, there's a couple standouts. Like I said, Alyssa's been good. But a lot of Mazie, I won't get into all of them, but like there's just a lot of them that they still haven't learned the lesson about how you really prosecute the case against these people. And Democrats, that's why I think sometimes it might need to be an outsider. I just think that like a lot of these older Democratic politicians, they're just not built for the world we live in now.
So when you were at Kenyon and when most of the audience was at Kenyon, you spent time reading political theory and thinking about the virtues of democracy versus other regimes, and so I have a question from someone about your generation at Kenyon, Will Seek from '99, asking how do we find the balance for the next 4 years between the democracy argument and kitchen table issues, right? That on the one hand, many of us are deeply, deeply concerned about the prospect of maintaining democracy in our country. We don't want to give up democracy, but apparently kitchen table issues are very compelling to the average voter and to many supporters of Mr. Trump. And so where are we going to? How does the average Trump opponent manage this balance? Can you have the big conversation, or do you have to just get down and fight about the kitchen table issues?
Yeah, I mean, if I was going to do a percentage, I would do 95 kitchen table issues, 5% big picture democracy. And here's the reason. Look, like I said, I gave this TED talk on democracy, and part of it is I keep saying it because it would be just watch that at some point. So I won't go into all of it, but I'll just say this. Voters don't care about democracy in the sense that democracy is polarized now itself. Like when you'll see a poll and the poll will say that democracy was the third biggest issue. Do you know who's in that? Some of them are people who think there are Democrats who think Donald Trump's a threat to democracy and a bunch of Republicans who think Joe Biden stole the 2020 election. Okay, so the word democracy doesn't mean anything to people. Does it mean voting? Does it mean pluralism? Does it mean just like that thing we do here, which is, by the way, sort of what it means to the average American, that thing we do here? And so my belief is that there's a political question. And the political question that is the one you asked, which is, do you make democracy a political issue, something people vote on? And my response to that is no, don't do that. However, I do think that if you want to tell a better story about democracy, you need to tell a better story about America, right? You need to help people remember like what it is that makes America special. Why is pluralism? Why is free speech? Like, why are the things that we do here special? Why is the rule of law sort of necessary, right? But then you got to remember that when you say rule of law, there's a bunch of Republicans who are like, they weaponized the Department of Justice against Trump. And so you just have to remember all the time that these things do not mean to everybody what they mean to you and like the people that you're talking to or in like your social media feeds think that they do, which is why I would say so we're about to have the 250th anniversary of the Constitution. And I think it's a good opportunity for a lot of people who care about democracy to tell a story about America and why it's special and why American democracy itself is worth preserving and why it matters so much. But I don't think we can just keep saying democracy, democracy, democracy and assume people are having the same conversation and assuming people will vote for something because of it.
So if it's mostly kitchen table issues, um, there are reports every day, maybe only in the media I read, about jobs created, bridges rebuilt, new chip factories. There's a long list of things that have happened over the last 4 years that, one might think should suggest to people that things are going pretty well. Why are they not going so well? This is we have a speaker coming a little later in the semester, Annie Lowry from the Atlantic, to talk about this. Why is it that things are not going so well when it seems like there are a lot of indicators that things are going pretty well?
Yeah. So, and this is where, look, this is where a lot of my frustration with Biden comes in, and why I don't think he was the right person. Why Biden should never have run. Like, I don't know if I am very firm on this. I was firm on it when it happened, and I thought when he had a health event in front of the country, Biden needed to have not run for the second term. That was the catastrophic mistake and the thing that was unrecoverable. Part of that because just the global trends were, and you heard a lot of this after the election. I want to belabor it too much. But incumbents were losing because inflation is high everywhere. But Joe Biden himself was not in a position to go on offense, and he because he didn't inspire a bunch of surrogates, because he was his ever since September of 2021, like he had his little honeymoon period, and then he pulled out of Afghanistan. Delta resurged and inflation started to rise, and his numbers had been sinking like a stone. Plus, everybody thought he was too old. Okay, all of that together meant he was deeply unpopular, which meant he didn't galvanize a group of people who went out and communicated on his behalf. So if you ask people, we just did this. So we did a focus group of Democrats, and we asked them about Joe Biden's legacy. What did he do that you're proud of or that you remember? Nobody had anything. They remembered. They were like, oh, he eventually got us out of COVID. But they don't. And do you know who's going to benefit the most from the infrastructure bill? Donald Trump, because none of that stuff was coming to fruition. And this is where, look, in some ways, this is where Joe Biden was just not built for this exact moment. And I'll say also, though, I think he was the only one that was going to beat Donald Trump in 2020. I'm not anti-Joe Biden. I just think he made a narcissistic, selfish decision going into 2024 and couldn't read the room. Yeah. Wait, sorry. Once again, what was the question?
No, I was
I
just,
realize I'm
it's
just
just
going off on Biden.
that the extent to which it would seem that there were,
But this
many accomplishments, but your point
mainly the
about
economy. The economy is in a good place from a macro standpoint. But Joe Biden, when Donald Trump was the president, he was running the economy hot, right? He's spending tons of money, he's cutting taxes, but he's running around to everybody being like, best economy for black people, best economy for women. Hey, buddy, how's your 401k? Like, he was a hype man for his policies. Joe Biden was like, people will notice. People will notice if I do some good things for them. That is not the way it works anymore. And I'm sorry about that. And also, when you talk about this, Democrats always want to give people a PowerPoint. They always want to be like, well, the macro economy and the GDP is up here. Okay, well, then you've got to be able to sell your policies and why they're good, but you've also got to be able to frame it as a recovery, right? The chart that they should be showing people, the thing that they should be saying is, we are leading the world in economic recovery right now in COVID. Nobody's doing it better than us. But you don't hear people going out there and making a robust case for that, in part because people didn't feel good about the economy. But that's cyclical too. People don't feel good about the economy in part because you're not making them feel good about the economy. So a lot of that was a communications thing. And people like crime, people are like, well, crime's down. And I'm like, okay, but carjackings and theft is up, and people can't get the deodorant out at a CVS because it's all locked up. And that creates a perception of a country that people are like, well, this doesn't feel like it used to. And so while on paper things are good, if you can't figure out where the rub is in people's daily lives, you're just missing a big part of the story.
So I'm going to switch gears just for a minute, if we could, and ask you something sort of a little bit more personal. which is this, despite the challenges of our times and your unhappiness with the directions our politics have gone and your efforts to, move them in another direction. It seems to have been a pretty good time for you. You're often asked to make media appearances, not as good as this media appearance, of course, you're on shows frequently. The Bulwark has taken off. It's added more and more features. And I'm sure many of those watching this conversation are subscribers like I am, and find what you and your colleagues are doing there to be very valuable. So there are some students watching. There are some parents of students watching. Um, can you tell us about how Kenyon might have helped you prepare for the many communications and management responsibilities you now have?
Oh, I love this question. So when I was there, my professors, uh, Pamela Camaro, Pamela Jensen, I don't know if you guys remember these people, Fred Bauman, like those people, they were my world. I looked up to them so much, thought they were so smart. But you know what they did? Um, it taught me to love American democracy. Like liberal democracy in America is one of my favorite classes. And I think that we are in a moment where people are kind of craving authentic voices. And I think that the Bulwark was born out of, our fear. And I think people coming from the right who saw the political right abandoning everything it stood for. And I think that here's one of the things Kenyon did. I find that a lot of people struggle to make their case. They struggle to speak, right? They struggle to say, here's what I think. And Kenyon, they do the seminars and you're forced to argue with each other and like really get into these, you learn to make your case. And I think there's a lot of schools now who they just don't even teach kids to be like, no, back up your argument. All right, you think that, tell us why. Walk us through the steps about why you think it. Now defend it against my challenge. And Kenyon was great at that. And also the personal relationships that I had with the professors, the way that they give you just their time. I mean, like you're a kid. I remember, I'll tell you, you said personal, so it's a little bit of a personal story, but like my senior year at Kenyon, I know I already said I played softball. This is a lesbian joke, but I was like kind of coming out to myself and trying to figure out how I was going to go had a job at a conservative think tank that I was going to start when I left Kenyon. And I was like, what am I going to do? And Professor Jensen like drove me. We went and got Wendy's and she drove me to some reservoir and we sat and we talked about it because she was my, we had what is that, like an individual seminar or whatever.
Mhm.
And I just remember her telling me like, everything's going to be okay. And, you're going to like, I don't know. Kenyon was the kind of place where she was one of the first people that I told what was going on because I needed an adult to help me figure out how I was going to balance my personal life and my professional life, a professional life that I couldn't even imagine, couldn't even see. And it's one of the reasons that people are always like, Kenyon people are weird about Kenyon. They like love it so much. And I'm like, yeah, it's the greatest thing ever. And I'll say, like Fred Bauman still sends me people. I said I got three. I got a baseball player, a basketball player, and then just someone who didn't play sports, which is fine. But I've got three Kenyon kids working in my office right now, and they're fantastic. They still know how to write. They still know how to argue, like make good arguments, and they're nice kids. Like they're nice, thoughtful kids. So and my best friends are all still from Kenyon. And I still keep in touch with those professors. It's just the best.
That's terrific to hear. So, I think probably most of us who follow public affairs at all are kind of voracious for um, knowing what we should be reading next, or where we should be getting our news. This is, as you mentioned, a new communications environment. And so, do you have any suggestions? Are there a book or two or three that you think we all ought to dash out and get on our bedstands? Or is there a new source of information beyond the Bulwark, because we know that's first rate. But beyond that, that we ought to be following so that we're up to date and know how to respond in this difficult time.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I nothing like sort of jumps to mind as like an individual book. I got to be honest. I got 2 kids and I read a million. I can't remember the last time I read a book.
Yeah.
Uh, but I will say this. From the time that I started doing uh the work that I do, like I left my company and I sort of founded this other stuff and started doing the focus groups. The shift in the last 8 years in the media environment, I cannot overstate it. Like not just in the like everything has changed so much. It's so fragmented, and finding people that you trust and who give you good, nutritious information, right? Is really hard. And one of the things that I'll say, this is a terrible answer because it's the inverse of what you asked me, but I feel strongly about it, which is there's a bunch of people who will sell you hopium. Like there were a lot of hopium merchants going into 2024 who were like, no, everything's going to be fine. And here's all the reasons why everything's fine. And just still read things. So sometimes people ask me what I read. And I'll be like, oh, I still read National Review and like a bunch of these, the Wall Street Journal editorial page. And I lose my mind. I'm so angry. I sit there and I'm like, you're wrong. But it's really important to read people you disagree with. Like the worst muscle that we are losing is the ability, like we silo ourselves into these places where they tell us what we want to hear. And people say it to me all the time from the focus groups. They're like, don't just tell me something good, Sarah. Tell me something I want to hear. And I'm like, well, I'm just going to tell you what I think the truth is. And it's not, and that you will be rewarded for that in the long term of finding people who will tell you good or bad what they really think. And also things that like aren't in your wheelhouse. Don't just make yourself feel better because it's a disservice to yourself.
Sarah, you've been so kind to spend an hour with us. We learn so much listening to you, reading you, seeing you when you appear on various programs that we
Stop watching cable
watch.
news. Everybody stop watching cable news. That's the other thing. I'm barely going to go on this time. It's too brain dead. Like, yes, I get asked to go on a lot and I'm like, what's the point? What am I going to have a 4-minute fight with Scott Jennings? Is that helping anybody's mental health? No. And so anyway,
Okay, we'll read you and watch you on the Bulwark then. But you are so kind to have spent this time with us. It's been terrific. I want to thank the folks who've helped to make this happen in alumni and parent engagement at Kenyon, Annie Gordon, Molly Vogel, Heidi Boland. And especially you, Sarah, for taking the time with us tonight, and to everyone who joined us. Thank you for joining us, for taking your hour to have this conversation. I think it was real educational for all of us, and a joy to listen to you. So thanks so much.
great. Good luck, guys. But also, everything's going to be okay. Not great, but okay.